Chemical energy is stored in the chemical bonds that hold much of matter together. For example, strong chemical bonds hold the matter of water together. The chemical formula of water, H2O, shows that it contains two elements of matter. One is the element hydrogen, represented by the letter H. The second is the element oxygen, represented by the letter O. The formula also shows that there is twice as much hydrogen in water as oxygen. Different elements possess different numbers of subatomic particles, and as a result, each element has different properties. When the atoms of two or more elements are chemically bonded together, chemical compounds are formed. For example, one atom of oxygen chemically bonded to two atoms of hydrogen is the chemical compound called water. It is important to note that chemical compounds have very different characteristics from those of the elements they contain. For example, at ordinary temperatures and pressures, water is a liquid. Yet under the same conditions, both the hydrogen and oxygen from which it was formed are gases. Likewise, you would never suspect that the colorless gas inside soda bubbles contains carbon, an element that normally exists as a black solid. Soda bubble gas is a chemical compound called carbon dioxide and is represented by the chemical formula CO2. This formula shows that carbon dioxide contains one atom of carbon bonded to two atoms of oxygen. On Earth, atoms are almost always found attached to other atoms, forming what scientists call molecules. Molecules are combinations of atoms of one or more elements of matter joined together by strong chemical bonds. The DNA molecules found in living things are the most complicated molecules and can contain millions of atoms. But there are many common molecules that have just a few atoms. For example, just two atoms of hydrogen bonded together makes a molecule of hydrogen gas, which is represented by the formula H2. Likewise, most of the oxygen in the atmosphere exists as simple molecules made from only two oxygen atoms that are chemically bonded together and that are represented by the formula O2. Most species of living things, including all animals, are unable to carry out photosynthesis to make their own food. This means they must eat in order to obtain the energy they need. Living things feed on one another. As a result, in the living world, energy and matter are passed along through what are called food chains of organisms. The first link in any food chain are the food producers. They are photosynthetic organisms like plants. These organisms are able to produce food in the form of energy-rich glucose from non-living matter. The second link in a food chain are the primary consumers. They eat plants or other photosynthetic organisms. In this way, both energy and matter begin to move up the food chain. Next are the secondary consumers. They eat the primary consumers. Oftentimes birds like these are secondary consumers because they eat insects and other organisms that live on a diet of plants. Then come the tertiary consumers, who eat the secondary consumers. Tertiary consumers are often large meat-eating animals like this alligator. The final link in a food chain are the decomposers. They are organisms such as fungi and bacteria like these. Decomposers cause decay. They break down dead materials and turn them into nutrients for the food producers. Of all the chemical reactions in the living world, perhaps none is as important as photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a Greek word that means to make from light, and by looking at its equation, we will learn why it was given this name. During photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water are chemically combined, using energy from sunlight to make the sugar called glucose, a chemical compound which ends up storing the sun's energy in its chemical bonds. The equation also shows another important fact. Photosynthesis makes oxygen for organisms to use. But it is important to point out that you won't get glucose and oxygen just by mixing carbon dioxide and water together in the sunlight. All you will get is warm carbonated water. This is because photosynthesis only takes place in plants and plant-like organisms, those that possess the amazing light-trapping molecule called chlorophyll. In fact, without chlorophyll, which gives plants their greenish color, there can be no photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is extremely important because it is just about the only way that living things obtain both energy and oxygen. In fact, without photosynthesis, there would be no oxygen at all in our atmosphere. As we have learned, food producers, such as the green-colored algae seen here, make oxygen as well as glucose. Oxygen is extremely important to living things, but did you ever wonder why? The reason is that nearly all organisms, even ocean dwellers like these, must have oxygen to break down the chemical bonds of glucose to release its stored energy. The process by which this happens is called cellular respiration, and its chemical reaction is the exact opposite of the reaction for photosynthesis, because the products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cellular respiration. The equation shows that when glucose reacts with oxygen, the sugar is broken down into carbon dioxide and water, and energy is released. Inside of living cells, the energy released from glucose ends up being transferred to another chemical compound called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And it is ATP that is actually used whenever a cell needs immediate energy to power a life process.
Our fellow humans, the many kinds of plants and animals around us, we're all alike in one very important way. We all need nourishment. We all need food. Food, in all its forms, is the fuel that keeps the fires of life burning. We humans, and the many different critters sharing the planet with us, get the food we need by eating. Eating isn't the only way, however, that living things can get their nourishment. Take green plants, such as the beauty I'm looking at here, for example. They can't eat, so green plants get their food another way. They make it using one of the most vital processes in all nature, photosynthesis. Today we'll explore how photosynthesis works and why it's so important. Let's start by looking at the word photosynthesis. Photo means light, and synthesis means to put something together. And that's exactly what happens. During photosynthesis, plants use the sun's energy to put together glucose, a type of sugar from simpler chemicals. Here's an outline of how the process goes. First, plants collect the raw materials they need for photosynthesis. These are two common substances. Water is the first, The second is carbon dioxide. It's a common gas in the air around us. Their roots absorb the water plants need for photosynthesis. Roots are covered with tiny hair-like growths called root hairs. They absorb water from the soil. This is then transported to the plant's leaves, where it's used. Leaves are nature's food factory. They're where green plants carry on most of their photosynthesis. Here's a cross-section of a typical leaf as it looks through a microscope. Notice the tiny openings or pores on its underside. Called a stoma, each of these openings is a tiny door through which air and the carbon dioxide it contains enters leaves. Once they have water and carbon dioxide, leaves have the raw materials needed for photosynthesis. However, something else is required before the process can actually start. And that something is sunlight. That's because it's light from the sun that provides the energy for photosynthesis. Look carefully at leaves and you'll see how well they're suited to capture the sun's energy. Their thin shape allows sunlight to easily reach the cells where photosynthesis takes place. And here's the leaf's inside again. The small granules you see in its cells are called chloroplasts. They contain a complex green-colored chemical called chlorophyll. However, in this slide, the chloroplasts look blue because of the way in which it was prepared. It's chlorophyll that gives leaves, such as these giant water lilies, their characteristic green color. Chlorophyll also gives the green color to plants such as these cacti and this palo verde bush. Both live in sun-baked desert areas, and to reduce water loss, they grow few or no leaves. Instead, as their green color shows, they have chlorophyll in their trunks, stems, and branches, letting them carry on photosynthesis there. But regardless of where it is, when sunlight falls on chlorophyll, light energy is absorbed and a series of complex chemical reactions begins. These reactions split some of the carbon dioxide molecules plants take in into carbon and oxygen atoms. The same thing happens to some of the water molecules plants absorb. They're broken apart into hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Some of the resulting carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms then join together to make glucose, a kind of sugar. This glucose contains stored energy which came from the sun. Plants do different things with the glucose their photosynthesis produces. They use some of it right away as food to provide the energy they need to carry on their life processes. Plants can also change some of the sugar they make into starch and store it for later use. And here we see some of that stored energy. Whenever we dine on potatoes, yams, and similar foods, we're eating food which plants stored in their roots as starch to meet their future energy needs. Plants also store energy in their seeds, or as we sometimes call them, grains. Later, this stored food energy is used by the young plants that sprout from these seeds. We humans also benefit greatly from these energy-rich foods, both by eating them ourselves and by feeding them to our animals. But as important as it is, photosynthesis provides more than just food alone. Take, for example, breathing. It may be hard to believe, but without photosynthesis, we couldn't. And that's because the world's oxygen supply is a byproduct of photosynthesis. Here's how. Remember how earlier we learned that during photosynthesis, plants use light energy to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Plants use some of the oxygen atoms for their own life processes. Some of them, however, are released into the air around them. We humans breathe this oxygen, the oxygen photosynthesis produces, as do all the many other critters, both big and small, that share the planet with us. In addition, some of the oxygen photosynthesis produces becomes dissolved in the world's waters. This is the oxygen that fish and other aquatic critters, such as this crab, use. And then there are our fuels. Believe it or not, nearly all the fuels that do such things as power our vehicles, cook our food, and keep us warm come to us thanks to photosynthesis. Called fossil fuels, much of the energy we use comes from fuels formed from the remains of green plants and other organisms that lived and carried on photosynthesis millions of years ago. Since then, their remains have changed into natural gas, oil, and coal. Today, when we burn these fuels, we are actually reaching back into time and benefiting from energy that photosynthesis captured from the sun hundreds of millions of years ago. As we've seen today, photosynthesis is one of nature's most important processes. Powered by the sun's energy and fueled by water and carbon dioxide, photosynthesis not only gives us, and countless other living things, food, it also provides the oxygen we and other organisms breathe, as well as fuels to warm us and power our vehicles. Now let's take a few minutes to answer some questions. They'll help you remember the key points we covered today. The directions are simple. When you hear this tone, check either true or false, or fill in the blank with the correct word. Good luck, and let's get started. True or false? One of